My South Carolina beach house was a serene retreat that I rented out on Airbnb whenever I wasn't using it. With 3 bedrooms and a single bathroom, it was perfect for a relaxing coastal getaway. I kept 2 guest bedrooms open for renters, but the master bedroom was my private sanctuary, locked away from prying eyes. It held my clothes and personal items, saving me the trouble of hauling them back and forth between visits. The master bedroom was doubly secure, with both a regular lock and a deadbolt, ensuring that no one could enter without my permission. Although I didn't store any high-value items there, it remained my private space. Early last spring, I decided to make the long journey from my home in chilly Massachusetts to my South Carolina house for a week of relaxation. Working remotely allowed me the flexibility to take such trips whenever I pleased. Typically, I would schedule a cleaning service after each guest departed, with the cost included in the Airbnb rental fee. However, this time, I planned to handle the cleaning myself since I intended to stay immediately after the previous guest's departure. The previous renter, a man named Ramon, had messaged me seeking recommendations for local restaurants. He mentioned that he and his fiancée were renting my house, and his inquiries gave me the impression that he was a trustworthy guest. I generally preferred renting to couples or smaller groups of women to avoid the risk of hosting rowdy groups of young men who might damage the property. My journey began early in the morning, and after a grueling 16-hour drive, I finally arrived at my South Carolina haven around 10 p.m. I unlocked the front door, parked my car, and retrieved my bags. The exhaustion from the lengthy drive weighed on me, and I bypassed any thorough inspection of the house, heading straight for my bedroom door to unlock it. Without bothering to brush my teeth or perform any bedtime rituals, I collapsed onto the bed. The strain of a 16-hour drive had taken its toll, and I fell into a deep slumber within minutes. However, my peaceful rest was short-lived. I awoke to find myself in complete darkness, with the bedside clock indicating it was only 11:30 p.m. I had been asleep for a mere hour and a half when something abruptly roused me. I instinctively reached for my phone, scanning for messages or notifications, and then switched on the bedside lamp. I surveyed the room, trying to discern what had awakened me. I ventured into the living room, my senses heightened. There, I began to assess the situation. Oddly, I observed that nothing seemed out of place. No displaced pillows, no spilled drinks. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it. I moved to the bedrooms, expecting to find the guests. Although the bed covers in one room appeared slightly rearranged, the occupants were conspicuously absent. Curiously, the space was immaculate, as if the guests were the neatest I'd ever hosted. Unsettled by these findings, I decided to review the security camera footage from the front porch. I rarely checked the camera unless a guest was causing trouble, but my curiosity was piqued. The video revealed a man entering the house 3 days prior using the code lock, but he was alone. There was no sign of a woman accompanying him. This was indeed perplexing. I then scrutinized the footage for any movement updates from the moment of his arrival up to my own entrance. To my growing unease, the recordings showed absolutely nothing, no movement, no signs of life, as if time had stood still. A shiver ran down my spine, and a gnawing sense of dread began to settle in. I contacted Ramon through the Airbnb app, despite the late hour, to inquire about his checkout status. Approaching the bedroom that Ramon had used, I commenced a thorough search, inspecting beneath the bed and inside closets. Each closet door swung open, revealing nothing but empty spaces. My heart raced with each reveal, but the persistent void in each closet only deepened my anxiety. My search led me to the second guest bedroom, where the twin beds remained pristine and untouched. Determined, I yanked open closet doors one by one, only to find them equally barren. Panic clawed at my senses as the minutes ticked by. Exhausted and disheartened, I lowered myself onto one of the twin beds. My gaze shifted to the exchange of messages between Ramon and me. It was during this introspection that I heard it. A soft click, unmistakably the sound of the master bedroom door latching shut. The act was deliberate, conducted with purpose, not the accidental drift of a door. My voice trembled as I called out, "Ramon, are you still in there?" Silence echoed in response. I noticed that light spilled from beneath the door, indicating that the room was still occupied. Cautiously, I dropped to all fours and peered beneath the door, my heart pounding. What I saw sent me sprawling backward. 2 feet stood ominously on the other side, just a couple of feet from where I knelt. I swiftly moved to the kitchen, intending to grab the largest carving knife. To my horror, the knife was missing. With my options dwindling, I decided to leave the house and call 911. I waited anxiously outside until the police arrived. Upon entering the house, they discovered Ramon waiting calmly in the living room, devoid of any weapon. He spoke with a Portuguese accent, feigning innocence and claiming that he merely needed a place to stay for one more night. An obvious lie. Despite my insistence and the bizarre circumstances, the police allowed him to leave after half an hour of questioning. Their advice was to contact Airbnb and attempt to resolve the situation through the platform. After their departure, I changed the lock code on the door and reached out to Airbnb to report the incident. While I did not receive payment for the extra day Ramon spent squatting in my house, they did ban him from using the app again. Yet, this resolution did not provide the closure and justice I sought. It was a chilling reminder that I had narrowly avoided a potential confrontation with a stranger lurking in my own home, waiting to strike. In the summer of 2016, my boyfriend Sean and I embarked on a trip to Vermont. Our destination was an Airbnb, described as an off-grid cabin with hundreds of glowing 5-star reviews. It was nestled in the remote, picturesque wilderness of Vermont, down an ancient dirt road. Only one other house, owned by the host, was half a mile away, and she happened to be away during our stay. It all seemed idyllic and far from sketchy, so we felt comfortable. The cabin itself was a charming relic, a one-room structure with a potbelly stove and a loft for sleeping. With no electricity, it promised an escape from the digital world. Our first evening was delightful, spent cooking dinner and playing board games by the warm glow of candlelight. After a day of hiking, we were both exhausted and retired to bed around 10 p.m. The unsettling events of that night began when I was roused from the borderland between deep sleep and wakefulness by a resounding thud that reverberated through the cabin. I struggled to shake off my grogginess and, still half asleep, yelled down to Sean to confirm if he had heard it too. His reply was equally baffled as he confirmed the noise, but assured me it wasn't him. At that point, our initial bewilderment overshadowed any real concern. Perhaps a fallen tree branch was responsible, we thought. My drowsiness tugged at me, and I was slowly drifting back to sleep when a second, much louder bang echoed through the cabin. This time, the noise originated from a different part of the structure. Panic set in as I leaped out of bed and hurriedly descended from the loft. Sean had also jumped into action and was making his way inside from the porch. With a veil of confusion shrouding our thoughts, we exchanged hushed words. We considered the possibility of a broken tree branch once more, but something felt awry. Our frequent camping experiences had hardened us against the eerie sounds of the night, but this was different. Unbeknownst to us, it marked the beginning of an ordeal neither of us would ever forget. As Sean ventured outside to investigate further, he left me with a grim request: collect all the sharp objects within reach and return to the loft. He projected a facade of calm, but his unease was palpable. I, too, felt the ominous presence of an unseen intruder. Sean speculated that he may have heard footsteps while outside, but his search yielded no clues. Back inside, we waited in silence, acutely aware of the cabin's vulnerability. 3 walls of the downstairs were adorned with enormous windows, half of which were mirror screens. If someone was lurking outside, they could easily spy on us or pierce through the frail screens to gain access. Our car sat parked about 100 feet away from the cabin, but reaching it meant confronting the unknown entity that lingered in the darkness. We couldn't shake the feeling that this was precisely what the unseen intruder wanted. Fearful that our tires might be slashed or the driveway obstructed, we dared not venture outside. Sean instructed me to remain upstairs while he kept watch downstairs. He reasoned that our odds of survival were better if I stayed hidden in the loft, granting him the element of surprise should it come to that. I obeyed, clutching a cluster of steak knives while Sean armed himself with a hunting knife and a stout stick. Darkness pressed in around us, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the cryptic scraping sounds against the cabin walls. To signal our presence and perhaps deter the intruder, Sean called out, "Hello?" Silence swallowed the cabin, punctuated only by our own shallow breaths. Inexplicably, the noises resumed, increasing in intensity and unpredictability. The cabin reverberated with unnerving bangs from different sides, interspersed with erratic scraping. It became unmistakable that this was not the work of an animal. The sounds were too methodical, lacking the characteristic grunts of a bear or the feral cries of a bobcat. Instead, methodical footsteps echoed all around, one foot following the other in chilling rhythm. Terror had us in its grip. The night wore on, marked by prolonged periods of chilling silence, broken by renewed outbursts of inexplicable sounds. At times, it felt as if an eternity had passed between the strange occurrences. Amid this eerie symphony, an unsettling rattling noise began outside, resembling someone attempting to climb the pipe connected to the potbelly stove. The relentless suspense had us frozen in our makeshift refuge. As the hours wore on, the first faint light of dawn began to pierce the darkness. The sounds outside finally ceased, and a sense of relief washed over us, mingled with exhaustion. With daybreak, the tension slowly eased its grip, and we contemplated the events of that night in the feeble morning light. Our experience defied explanation, as we had never encountered anything remotely like it in our camping adventures. With the passing hours, the oppressive dread began to subside, and we gathered our belongings with haste. Our car remained untouched, and we swiftly packed, eager to escape the haunted cabin. Our Airbnb host received a message detailing our strange night, and her response was cryptic. She dismissed our encounter, suggesting that it might have been a porcupine, an utterly absurd explanation for the nightmarish ordeal we had endured. To this day, Sean and I debate the nature of those sounds that haunted us in the remote Vermont cabin. He believes it might have been a local resident intent on frightening us away. But regardless of the explanation, I am eternally grateful that we were not met with a more sinister fate that night. Owning an Airbnb property had been a lucrative venture for us over several years. However, the stress of maintaining our regular jobs alongside the demands of the rental business had started to take its toll. The benefit of listing with Airbnb was undeniable, the potential for significant earnings, especially in a high-traffic vacation area like ours. Initially, my wife and I were enthusiastic, but as the bookings increased, so did the pressure. The routine had been established. Guests arrived, I sent them the door code, and we rarely interacted beyond a few text messages. Our guests were usually courteous, and the system worked like clockwork. Until one night. It was an unassuming evening when a seemingly young couple arrived at our property. Like clockwork, I texted them the door code, expecting them to settle in without issue. My day off had just begun, and I looked forward to relaxation. Little did I know, this night would plunge us into a nightmare. Around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed, and I discovered a text from the male guest stating that he would call me in a minute. Odd, but nothing too unusual. Moments later, his call came through, and the conversation took a surreal turn. He claimed that the water wasn't working in the house. Baffled, I couldn't fathom how this was possible, but the thought of guests staying in a property without water was unacceptable. It was imperative to rectify the situation immediately. I asked if I could visit quickly to assess the issue, intending to arrange for a repair in the morning. He agreed, his politeness disguising an underlying tension. With a sense of urgency, I drove to the property. As I approached, I noticed 2 cars parked outside, a curious sight for a young couple on a single-night vacation. Initially, I assumed they had visitors, a breach of our rental agreement, but that didn't concern me much at the time. I knocked on the door, then entered the code and walked inside. The interior was eerily silent. I half expected them to greet me, but they were nowhere to be seen. A creeping unease gnawed at me, but I brushed it aside, attributing my discomfort to fatigue. My first task was to check the main water valve in the basement. There, I encountered a puzzling sight. The valve had been manually closed, rendering the house waterless. Perplexed, I remedied the issue and started to wonder why anyone would have done this. Unnerved, I considered leaving to contact them instead, but decided to inspect further. As I turned to ascend the stairs, the basement door swung open and 3 imposing figures entered, men much older than the guests I had expected. Their question about the water was punctuated with an unsettling familiarity, reminiscent of the man I had spoken to on the phone. A palpable tension hung in the air as they awaited my response. I recounted the valve's issue without accusation, aiming to keep the situation calm. Their silence weighed heavily as I wrapped up my explanation, and I could no longer ignore the uncomfortable atmosphere. It was then that I noticed it, a gun concealed in the waistband of one of the men. Panic surged through me, and I hastened up the stairs, desperate to leave the basement. To my astonishment, the 3 men remained below, watching me as I retreated. Their chilling silence sent shivers down my spine, and I rushed out of the house into the safety of my car. With a pounding heart, I sped away, my mind racing to comprehend the bizarre encounter. Upon returning home, I awakened my wife and recounted the unsettling ordeal. Fearing the worst, she urged me to contact the police. Time dragged on as we waited anxiously for the authorities to arrive at the Airbnb property. However, the occupants were no longer present, and their identities remained a mystery. Their bizarre use of a stolen credit card and the theft of valuable items from the house only deepened the enigma. The ordeal left us with more questions than answers. Why had they deliberately manipulated the water supply? Were they hoping to evade payment, or, even more sinisterly, planning to rob us at gunpoint? The inexplicable decision to let me leave unharmed still haunts my thoughts. In the aftermath of this harrowing experience, we ceased Airbnb operations and opted to rent out the property conventionally. The nightmarish encounter served as a stark reminder that not all guests could be trusted, and sometimes the shadows concealed unimaginable horrors. This chilling tale unfolded during my solo trip to Lyon, France. I had embarked on this journey from the States and decided to book a stay with an elderly couple in their rustic home. They were in their mid-60s, and despite being a new listing with only a couple of reviews, the positive feedback and the photos convinced me that this place, while not luxurious, was an affordable gem in an excellent location. Upon my arrival, the older couple greeted me warmly, even preparing a delightful dinner for me. It was a gracious gesture that I couldn't decline. We shared stories and engaged in pleasant conversation. Later that evening, around 10 p.m., they retired to their rooms, leaving me to explore the city and enjoy a few drinks. Upon my return, however, the house was eerily silent. My hosts were nowhere to be found, presumably asleep. I thought they had mentioned that dinner was in the fridge for me to help myself, so I poured a glass of wine and settled down. I've always had trouble falling asleep, but that night was different. The fatigue from the day's travel and the wine led me into slumber with surprising ease. Sometime during the night, I was roused from my sleep by a flash of lightning. You know that feeling when your eyes are shut, but you can still sense the brightness of the flash? It was just like that. I lay in bed, eyes closed, waiting for the accompanying thunder. I began counting the seconds between the lightning and the anticipated thunderclap. My mother used to say that for every second you count, the lightning is 1 mile away. So I counted 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20, 30. But there was no thunder. Then, again, through my closed eyelids, I felt another flash of light. I waited for the thunder, but once more, silence persisted. Curiosity piqued. I sat up in bed and opened my eyes to investigate. In my room, there were my 2 hosts, Initially, I didn't fully grasp the bizarre nature of the situation. I was still half asleep, my thoughts muddled. Yet, I could sense something was terribly amiss. They wore latex masks, grotesque human faces with exaggerated features. Those flashes of light I had seen were from a camera in the woman's hand. She had been taking pictures of me while I slept. The man, closer to the bed than his partner, was moving toward me. She stood by the door, both eerily motionless, like living statues. Panic began to creep over me, and I stammered out, "What do you want?" My voice trembled with confusion, fear, and adrenaline, which hadn't fully kicked in yet. The man, his voice muffled behind the latex mask, replied, "You're dreaming." He then backed away toward the door, stating, "Good night." But it wasn't until I noticed the gleam of a metal wrench clutched in his hand that the gravity of the situation fully dawned on me. Without further ado, I sprang from the bed, my senses now on high alert. Gathering my belongings hastily, I made a beeline for the front door, all the while scanning my surroundings frantically in case the old man ambushed me with that wrench from around any corner. Once outside, I immediately contacted the police, recounting the harrowing encounter. Unfortunately, no concrete evidence surfaced, and the elderly couple had been shrewd enough to delete all the photos they had taken of me. Airbnb's response was less than satisfactory. My complaints largely went unanswered. However, the couple removed their listing from the site. The incident left me shaken and filled with unanswered questions. What were their motives? Was it part of some sinister cult ritual, a twisted fetish, or something far more nefarious like potential snuff pictures? The old man had certainly appeared in the photographs, attempting to inch closer to me with that wrench. Regardless, I'll never take being a light sleeper for granted again. I continue to scrutinize Airbnb listings vigilantly, ensuring that no unexpected guests lurk in the shadows, waiting to intrude upon someone else's dark and twisted fantasy. Around 5 years ago, my husband and I embarked on a romantic couple's holiday to Paris with some close friends. The excitement was palpable as we planned our getaway, and one of our friends had found an Airbnb listing that piqued our interest. Located in a charming French village called Palazzo, just a short 15-minute drive from Paris, it offered the perfect blend of serene country living and the bustling Parisian experience. The anticipation of exploring Paris and immersing ourselves in its romantic ambiance was almost too much to bear. I had been practicing the bits of French I learned in school, though my proficiency was far from perfect. To my delight, the French people we encountered were incredibly gracious and patient with my attempts. We boarded the Eurostar to Paris, indulged in a delightful lunch, picked up a rental car, and then set out for the Airbnb. The countryside was enchanting, and I could hardly contain my excitement. Our friends and I explored the beautiful house while our husbands reveled in the masculine charm of the French decor. The backyard was a haven, featuring a vast green lawn that gave way to a dense patch of woodland at the far end. It felt like stepping into a dream, a perfect setting for a romantic weekend in one of the world's most enchanting cities. After an exquisite dinner at a local brasserie, we returned to the Airbnb, a tad inebriated but grateful for the warmth of our cozy abode. We continued to indulge in drinks and conversation in the kitchen, where my friend's boyfriend, a bit tipsy himself, began to playfully explore the cupboards and drawers. To our surprise, he unearthed a flashlight, a rather cheap one at that. Nevertheless, his discovery ignited a desire to venture into the dark woods at the rear of the property. We playfully teased him, likening him to the first character who met an untimely end in a horror movie. Unperturbed and fueled by alcohol, he headed into the garden. He spent approximately 10 minutes exploring the woods while the rest of us chatted animatedly, planning our day trip to Paris the following morning. Suddenly, his blood-curdling scream pierced the night, silencing us instantly. He burst through the back door, panic etched across his face, and urgently asked, "Who speaks the best French? We need to call the police, right now." Initially, my husband suspected he was playing a prank, but the sheer terror in his eyes left no room for doubt. His face had gone pale as a ghost. He implored, "I swear on my mom's life, this is not a joke. We need to call the police." The room erupted in a mixture of disbelief and panic as he finally revealed that while we weren't in immediate danger, there was a dead body in the woods behind the house. Shocked and horrified, we decided to call the police. My husband, however, insisted on seeing the body for himself, thinking it was some sort of macabre joke. My friend's boyfriend, the one who had found the body, tried to dissuade him, his voice trembling as he cautioned, "You don't want to do that, man. Trust me, she's in a bad state." His words struck fear into us. As the police arrived and began their investigation, we contemplated finding alternative accommodation for the night. We ultimately settled on a 4-star hotel in central Paris, hoping to salvage the remainder of our weekend. Little did we know that the ordeal was far from over. The police summoned us for questioning the following day. Apparently, if not for the apparent signs of foul play, we would have been free to leave. Instead, we found ourselves unwittingly caught up in a murder investigation, turning our romantic getaway into a nightmarish experience. Thankfully, we were eventually cleared of any involvement, allowing us to return home. The entire trip had been marred by surreal and horrifying events, but the strangest aspect was that the Airbnb owners had the audacity to ask us for positive reviews, despite the fact that we had discovered a dead body on their property. As the years passed, the memory of that ill-fated trip continued to haunt us, a reminder that sometimes, even the most idyllic settings can become the backdrop for unimaginable horrors. A few years ago, my partner and I embarked on a life-altering journey from the East Coast to the eerie, enigmatic Pacific Northwest. This expedition wasn't born out of wanderlust, but rather out of desperation. We were strangers in a strange city, armed only with a modest sum of savings and the hope for a fresh start. Our initial weeks in this unfamiliar territory were nothing short of exhilarating. The adrenaline of the unknown coursed through our veins, and we hadn't a regret in sight. Our plan was simple: bunk in hostels and inexpensive hotels until we secured steady employment and a place to call our own. Securing jobs proved surprisingly effortless as we quickly found gainful employment just days after landing on the West Coast. However, the search for a permanent abode would become a chilling odyssey of the paranormal kind. Each place we scouted seemed determined to elude our grasp, its entry barred by steep requirements, such as impeccable credit scores and an extravagant minimum household income. 2 months of transient life in a series of hostels and motels had worn us down, and desperation began gnawing at our resolve. It was at this point that we decided to venture into the surreal world of Airbnb. Our first encounters with Airbnb listings proved to be equally perplexing, with strange hosts and odd accommodations. Yet one peculiar listing caught my eye amidst the digital fog. The poster claimed to have a spacious house in a reputable neighborhood, offering a generously sized 500-square-foot room for an astoundingly low price of $600 a month, with utilities included. This offer was astonishingly affordable for a city where such deals were virtually unheard of. The listing itself was a curious amalgamation of a room advertisement and a diatribe against those who had labeled the host as creepy. Under normal circumstances, we would have dismissed this eccentric listing as a potential nightmare, but desperation had us in its thrall. We reached out to the enigmatic host via telephone, and his voice was surprisingly ordinary. In an uncharacteristic display of caution, he suggested we meet at a public location to discuss the room, and we wisely agreed without disclosing our current whereabouts. The rendezvous took place in a restaurant near our current hostel, and we carefully refrained from revealing our specific location. He arrived late, eyes widening in astonishment upon spotting us. After a long, rambling conversation, dominated by his monologues about feeling persecuted by the locals and his pursuits as an artist and collector, he mentioned that the room was currently occupied by his collection. He never elucidated the nature of this collection, but assured us that if things proceeded favorably, he would have it moved into storage to accommodate us. Throughout this peculiar tete-a-tete, he experienced a sudden bout of anxiety, rushing to the restroom. Seizing this moment, we whispered amongst ourselves, aware that something was awry. We reckoned that the room itself might provide some clarity, and thus we agreed to inspect it. He returned from the restroom in a sweaty, flustered state, declaring an immediate tour of the premises. We requested that he text us the address, intending to reach the location via public transportation. However, he adamantly insisted on driving us there, despite our reservations. He took us by surprise by summoning a rusty, decrepit pickup truck, its windows shattered as if echoing its driver's disheveled state. Although wary, we hesitantly climbed into the cramped cab. The drive commenced with our host's ceaseless chatter about the city's decline and his estrangement from former friends. Fear gripped us, and I secretly signaled my partner to prepare for a possible escape strategy. Our host, perceiving our unease, commented on our romantic togetherness, envying our youth. We eventually arrived at his home in a decent-looking neighborhood, his one-story ranch house seemingly at odds with his eccentricity. Oddly enough, we noticed iron bars on the windows and numerous locks adorning the front door. Our host justified these precautions, claiming to safeguard his valuable collection from thieves. Upon entering the house, our senses were assaulted by a noxious odor, a melange of mildew, moldy rubber, and neglect. The interior was a chaotic labyrinth of rubber, plastic, and latex clothing, interspersed with gas masks. The clutter was overwhelming, with each room reduced to a single precarious pathway. Our host, oblivious to the filth and disarray, prattled on about his treasured art and collection. His method of artistry, it turned out, was a grotesque fusion of innocence and perversion. He adorned baby dolls, stuffed animals, and children's toys with obscene appendages. The pièce de résistance was a ceramic horse figurine, decapitated and fitted with a baby doll's head, complete with a sculpted clay phallus in place of a horn. The collection, predominantly comprised of fetish attire and gas masks, was omnipresent, threatening to suffocate us with its sheer volume. The stench of decay clung to every corner of the house, and the carpet appeared to have escaped a vacuum cleaner for decades. We navigated through the eerie abode, our host pointing out his cherished artworks and repeating tales of local misfits who failed to grasp his creative genius. As we drew closer to the room, which he claimed was intended for us, he nonchalantly mentioned it was presently occupied by his beloved collection. Upon opening the door, our eyes fell upon a sight that defied description. The 500-square-foot room was packed to the brim with clothing racks, each bearing the same disturbing items: glistening rubber, latex, and plastic pants adorned with protruding appendages. It was a grotesque display of perversion and depravity. Despite our shock, we maintained our composure, expressing interest in the room while concealing our true feelings. We concocted an excuse to leave, stating that we would return to our hostel and deliberate on the offer. Our host acquiesced, and I silently urged him ahead to prevent him from locking the door behind us. As we left, he threw something into a darkened room, unnoticed until I used my phone's light to peer inside. The room was a grotesque mound of tied-off used condoms, a revolting testament to his aberrant proclivities. We rejoined him in his dilapidated truck, enduring a tense and awkward journey back to our initial meeting point. His rambling took on a more frustrated tone this time, as he repeatedly missed our intended drop-off point. Eventually, we made our escape at a red light, frantically uttering our thanks and bidding him a hasty farewell. In the ensuing days, he inundated us with texts inquiring about our decision. Though we were apprehensive, we politely declined his offer. Surprisingly, he took it well, acknowledging our concerns about his extensive collection. After a few more exchanges, we blocked his number, but not before he cryptically asked, "Are you creeped yet?" A message that echoed ominously in our minds.